So last season, the Boston Celtics were one of the more disappointing teams in the NBA, as they barely made the playoffs. This was mainly due to the fact that they had lots of injuries and they didn't have really good team chemistry, but nonetheless, they definitely need to bounce back. In this year's offseason, they had a pretty confusing one since a lot of people don't know whether or not to call them winners or losers of the offseason. That's led me to make this video where I'll be discussing the Boston Celtics offseason. Before we get into the video, I ask you to drop a like on this video as it does help my channel grow. Subscribe to my channel if you want daily NBA content, and if you want to help me reach my goal of 1,500 subscribers. Also drop a comment on this video as I do respond to all of my comments, and play that intro. To start the video off, I want to discuss what the Boston Celtics lost in this year's free agency. And I'm not going to lie, they did lose a lot of quality players. The most notable player that they lost was Kemba Walker, as they traded him to the Oklahoma City Thunder. Then eventually he was bought out by the Thunder, and then he signed with the New York Knicks. And honestly, I don't think losing him is too bad since he wasn't an amazing fit on the team, and he was really inconsistent and injury prone. And he's probably not even a top 15 point guard in the NBA right now, and that's not even a hot take. So I don't think they're going to miss him too crazily unless he bounces back in New York, which I do think there is a decent chance of that happening. But as of right now, I don't think it's too big of a loss, especially when you realize how much money they saved getting rid of his contract. They also lost Tristan Thompson to the Sacramento Kings in the trade. Honestly, I don't think it's amazing that they lost him, but Tristan Thompson's just an average NBA player, so I don't think they're going to get drastically worse just because they lost him. They also lost Evan Fournier in NBA free agency to the New York Knicks, and I think that's a tough loss since Fournier was probably a guy who could have been amazing off the bench for them as a scorer, as he created his own shot, and he's a really good shooter. He didn't do amazing while he was playing with Boston. He was really inconsistent, so maybe they just wanted to let him go, and they probably were smart to not pay him $20 million a year, so I don't know. The final guy they lost was Semi Ojeleye. I don't think that's a huge loss since he didn't really play, but I guess he was a good defender. But overall, I would say the Celtics lost a decent amount of players on the team, but not a crazy amount to where I would immediately give them an L, but that just shows that this team was not that deep or talented at all. They're very top heavy. Now I'm going to be talking about who the Celtics added onto their roster this offseason. They added Enes Kanter, who I think could be an okay replacement for Tristan Thompson. He's not as good on defense, but he's a way better offensive player. He is also a way better finisher. They also signed Dennis Schroeder, which I think is one of their biggest additions due to the fact that even though Dennis has a really negative stigma around his name right now, don't forget, 2 years ago he was viewed as a really good point guard in the league. And I just don't think he was a good fit for the Lakers, but even though he wasn't a great fit, he was still pretty good in the regular season. It was just the playoffs where he really struggled. But I think on the Celtics, he's going to have a bounce back year and have people taking back their words. And I'm a Lakers fan, so I shouldn't even like him, but I do think he's going to bounce back. They also got Al Horford from the Oklahoma City Thunder in a trade. They traded Kemba Walker for him. Then that was an absolutely amazing thing, since I believe Horford is not actually washed. He's probably not as good as he was 2 or 3 years ago, but he's not that much worse than he was 2 or 3 years ago. I still think he's an above average center in the NBA. He can still shoot and space the floor. He can defend at a really good level, and he's still a really good passer. So I think he's just going to make everything easier on this team because they never had a big man who could space the floor. And if the Celtics really do well this year, I guarantee you a lot of it is going to be because of Al Horford's stellar play. They also traded for Josh Richardson, and I think that's a decent move because just a few years ago in Miami, Josh was the guy who looked like he was potentially becoming an up-and-coming star, but after getting traded a bunch of times, now he's looking like an average player at best. But maybe with him changing the scenery, he could go back to his old level, playing averaging 15 points, being a decent three-point shooter and a really good defender. I think he's a really important player for them. If he can get back to his old self, it would drastically help this team. They also got Chris Dunn. He's a pretty good defensive guard. Maybe he could carve out a role on this team, but I'm not too high on his signing because, I don't know, he's probably not going to play. Now to answer the question of whether or not I think the Celtics had a good or bad offseason, I generally have to admit that I think it's literally in the middle because they did lose some decent players who were important for them like Kemba, Fournier, and Tristan Thompson. But at the same time, they got some guys like Dennis Schroeder, who I think is just a little bit worse than Kemba due to the fact that they're both really inconsistent, but when Kemba's playing well, he's better than when Dennis is playing well. And when it comes to Al Horford, he's obviously way better than Tristan Thompson. But when it comes to Evan Fournier versus Josh Richardson, I think Evan Fournier is better. So technically, I think the Celtics got a little bit worse this offseason, at least on paper. The only reason I'm giving them a W is because their roster like clearly need to go under some changes, and maybe the addition of Horford is what they need, because it's not just about the talent on paper, it's about how well the team meshes together. And I think there's a chance that this type of team could mesh well together because there's going to be new players in a new scenario. I can see a world where Dennis Schroeder plays better than Kemba did, and I can see a world where Josh Richardson goes back to his old self and is an above average shooting guard. So overall, I think I would lean towards them having a W offseason, like a really small W, since they did get off Kemba's contract and they did get a point guard in Schroeder who's just as good, I would say. But they definitely are one of the biggest winners in the offseason, but they're also not one of the biggest losers. Now to discuss how good I think the Celtics will be, I honestly feel like this is either going to be a disastrous season for the Celtics, where they're absolutely horrible and people are like, oh, should they trade Jaylen Brown? Should they trade Jason Tatum? That level of bad. Or it's going to be a season where they bounce back and everyone's surprised and people are like, oh, wow, look at the Celtics. Because this literally happens like a lot of times over the last 5 years with the Celtics. They'll have a great season, then they'll literally have a disappointing year the next year. Then right after that bad season, they'll have another good one, then have a bad one. Obviously, that's not how I got my reasoning, but I do think there's a chance that this team meshes well perfectly, and they get like possibly even the 3rd seed in the conference, because injuries are a real thing. And Jason Tatum has a MVP type level season. Or I could see them being like the 8th or 10th seed in the conference and barely making the playoffs, and maybe even missing it. But if I had to guess what I think is more likely, this might be a hot take, but I generally think it's more likely that the Celtics have a really good season this year, and I think they will finish somewhere around the 3rd to the 6th seed in the conference. And I'm saying this not as a Celtics fan, so I'm not being biased. I just think they're gonna break out this year. I just feel it. But to conclude the video, I think the Celtics are going to surprise a lot of people next year and have a great season. I still kind of question their future a little bit because I think they need more help. Like, they need to put more players alongside Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown to become legit NBA title contenders. But in terms of just being a good regular season team and a really good playoff team, I do think they will get back to doing that. And I think they'll have another really good season. They didn't really have that much cap space this offseason, so there also wasn't that much they could do overall. They did have an okay offseason, so I guess I would give them a W for sure. Anyways, guys, that's it for the video. Let me know whether or not you think the Celtics had a good or bad offseason. Drop a like on this video as it does help my channel grow. Subscribe to my channel if you want daily NBA content. And if you want to help me reach my goal of 1,500 subscribers. Also drop a comment on this video as I do respond to all of my comments. And I'm out.